we like to joke about how we have all been individually and collectively accused of trying to destroy the church, trying to burn down the church. We joke about that because that is not what we are trying to do. And yet there is this tiny little kernel of truth in there, because if you define church as a theological institution given life through the concepts and the practices that we've talked about as fundamentally enabling of sexual violence, then yes, actually, we are trying to dismantle that.
Okay. 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, you know, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. It seems to me, so I followed you all on Facebook a while ago and followed all the stories that you put out and everything. And it seems to me, just based on the comments under some of what you post, and yeah, that you tend to get intense pushback in the work that you do. And perhaps that's even putting it lightly. Why do you think you get such intense pushback, and what keeps you going on the hard days when it seems like everyone's against you?
Well, I think everybody is carrying trauma related to sexual violence, just everybody. And I don't say that because to equate everybody's, I'm not trying to say, oh, well, everybody's suffering equally. So what, you know what I mean? But I feel, maybe I'm kidding myself a little bit, but I feel like I can tell when somebody asks me what I do for a living and I give enough information that sexual violence becomes part of the conversation. I can frequently tell when somebody is like not ready for that because something happens in the eyes. Like sometimes they just check out, sometimes they change the subject completely. And you know, I try to resist interpreting that because I try to resist it. I just know that when you are talking about the subject of sexual violence, there's so much multi-generational secret keeping that if people haven't done some work around their own experiences, they are likely to respond out of their triggers and their baggage and their trauma without reflection. And I think that's part of why the pushback can be so intense. But I think we're also really shaking the foundations of how things have been done. And there is tremendous resistance from people who benefit from the way things are being done right now. That's a simple answer. Hilary, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. I think I would add that, so our work, the foundation of our work is a commitment to survivor-centeredness. And we don't come to that commitment from a society or a church that is simply neutral. Western US institutions, society, culture, and the church are starting from a place of perpetrator-centeredness. It's not what people claim, but the law prioritizes perpetrators. HR policies prioritize perpetrators. And most Christian theology prioritizes perpetrators as well. So when we are presenting survivor-centered options and pursuing survivor-centered processes, it is pushing against the established norm. And I think a lot of folks experience what is established as, not what's established for their institutions, but as themselves, right? As them, because it has been internalized. The theology has been internalized, and one's individual identity or community identity is rooted in that perpetrator centeredness actually being correct, morally, ethically, theologically correct. So when we're coming and saying, no, that is not correct, and I want you to turn over this whole entire system, then folks often react to us as if they personally or their community personally is being attacked. And of course, we are not attacking them personally, but we are unequivocally challenging the norms and ethics and theologies on which the identities of some individuals and communities are built. And if we pursue a survivor-centered process, then some identities and some aspects of certain communities of faith will need to be dismantled and rebuilt from a new perspective. So we like to joke about how we have all been individually and collectively accused of trying to destroy the church, trying to burn down the church. We joke about that because that is not what we are trying to do. And yet there is this tiny little kernel of truth in there, because if you define church as a theological institution given life through the concepts and the practices that we've talked about as fundamentally enabling of sexual violence, then yes, actually, we are trying to dismantle that. Right?
Yeah. There's some quote that's playing with my mind that it goes, it's something about like how people who are not used to accountability and justice, when they are met with that sense of accountability, it feels like an attack on their personhood. I'm not saying it right, but do you know what quote I'm
Absolutely
looking for? But yeah, that makes sense that people would react as if you are trying to burn down that person or burn down the church. And yeah, that's
You get a lot of pushback, I would say, from white women in particular. And I have wondered if part of what is going on there is that white Christian women have been told by their communities, culturally and theologically, that they are supposed to prioritize the well-being of others and see the good in others, particularly of quote unquote good men in the community of faith. And so what have they sacrificed in order to keep that up?
Yeah.
Whole lives, right? So then we come in here and survivors come in and say, no, actually, we're not playing by those rules anymore. And I think there's a little bit of something going on with white Christian women who are struggling with the idea that if others don't need to play by those rules, what does that mean about all that they have lost by having done so themselves?
Right. Yeah, it seems like a lot of like white women Christian identity is tied up in being like the peacemaker or the one that brings everyone together, that unites people. But that's not necessarily a true sense of peace. It's perhaps like avoidance of conflict. And you're like, no, if we're going to get a true peace, there has to be justice in that. Yeah, that's really interesting that you're kind of scratching away at this like identity. I'll have to think more about that. I'm wondering how your work is integrated into your personal passions. Like, do you, we had talked before, and you were both excited to talk about what makes you a bad Christian, however you identify, spiritual person. So yeah, how is your work integrated into your personal passions, if it is at all?
I'll let you go for that, Stephanie.
Well, I hesitate to speak for all of my colleagues, but I think I can say that with all of us, if this weren't a personal passion, we wouldn't be able to do it. I mean, everybody's a survivor. There's that. I have a particular passion for, I mean, this is going to sound so messed up, but I have a particular passion for understanding how people who identify themselves as peacemakers perpetuate violence. Because, I grew up Mennonite, and it really just helps me understand so much about my own childhood, about the kinds of insecurities that I took into adulthood, the ways that I tried to control and censor myself in order to not take up enough space. And when I am around Mennonites, I always feel like I'm too much, always. And nothing has been, I guess I'd use the phrase sane making for me, quite like working in sexual violence prevention and advocacy, for getting perspective on the things that I always assumed were just me. And not just working, I mean, yeah, I invoke Mennonites and peacemakers and peacemaking culture, because I think peacemaking culture in the Christian peace churches is tremendously patriarchal. I think we've only begun to show how much sexual violence and how much gender-based violence and how much racialized violence it produces. But it's also just working with survivors from any faith tradition. All of them teach people who don't conform, in particular, like white patriarchal defined ways, that were too much, that were a drain on resources, that when we have feelings, our feelings are inappropriate. When we have desires, our desires are inappropriate. It's just learning about the way sexual violence happens in society is just enormously, I've learned so much. And it's made me healthier as a person, even though I have massive secondary trauma issues because of, I have to work on that. I think all of us, anybody who does this kind of work has to work on that. You can't take it lightly. But what I've learned is just saved my life in so many ways.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. Hilary, do you want to?
Yeah. So the question is, how does the work that I do at IntAccount integrate with my personal interests?
Sure. Yeah. Kind of like you're talking about, what is your bad thing that may or may not have anything to do with IntAccount. And I realized we could just do a whole episode of Stephanie about what you talked about, and maybe when your book comes out, we'll have to have you back on. And yeah, we could make this into a separate episode. But yeah, I just maybe get a chance for you to talk about your own personal bad thing that you care about.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I have a lot of overlap with Stephanie's badness. I'm a really bad pacifist. In that I am not a pacifist. So I'm a very bad Mennonite. Because I think that pacifism is incredibly ethically problematic. My perspective on pacifism is that it is a component of unjust violence. And it's taken me a long time, a long way, in many degrees to get to clarity about what that means for me. But I have come to see pacifism in the way that it is typically expressed in Mennonite communities in North America, US and Canada especially, that pacifism is a cover for violence, actually. It is a shroud that we wear that allows us to perpetuate violence in our own communities under the guise of kind of this like city on a hill, ethically purer than our neighbors' approach to violence in other parts of the world. So yes, I'm a bad pacifist. But like, I'm also a pretty bad Christian if you define Christianity in terms of, the average way that so-and-so on the street would define sin and atonement and grace and forgiveness and Jesus and God. Like, there's no theological principle really that I wouldn't kind of want to say like, well, let's think a little bit about that. And then when it comes to like how this is all integrated with my work at Into Account, it has been absolutely essential for me to take issue with really central parts of how I was raised as a Christian pacifist Mennonite, in order to move into a position where I can act in genuine solidarity with survivors. So I have needed to become a bad Christian and become a bad Mennonite, and in some ways become a bad feminist, in order to have the internal capacity and like the embodied skills to do this work of confronting sexual violence and being with survivors in their agency as they do that. And it's personal for me because, like Stephanie said, I'm a survivor. All of the staff at Into Account are survivors. And so there was a point in time where Stephanie acted as an advocate for me when I was going through a process of asking for transparency and accountability from Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary that mishandled my reporting of sexual assault when I was a student there. So all of the work that I do theologically is because theology has been violent in my life, and I understand in a very deep personal way what's at stake if we don't make shifts in what we are teaching about God and church and each other. And I learn more about the kinds of shifts that we need to make and what's possible from the survivors that we work with as clients.
I got like absolute goosebumps / chills when you talked about how you needed to become a bad Christian Mennonite pacifist in order to not only take care of yourself, but begin to enter into your advocacy work. I mean, it cuts to the heart of what I'm trying to bring to the table with this podcast.
Can I actually give a really quick concrete example?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because like that's true in like an internal identity sense, but it's also true in like the concrete work that I was doing in the world. There was a point in time where I was the co-coordinator of the Women in Leadership Project for Mennonite Church USA. And in many ways, that was an important position. One of the things that I was tasked with was organizing a Women in Leadership conference that Mennonite women were invited to. And at that first conference, it was like a major deal to put together. There was a person who was a speaker who had recently published something that was very anti-queer and hurtful to LGBTQ folks. My position and my superiors required of me to kind of smooth over the conflict, right? So at the conference, there were LGBTQ people and allies who were very upset at the idea of a person who had made anti-queer statements speaking. And there were other folks who were very upset at the idea that we would not have her speak because of what she had said. And it was very complex, more so than I can really articulate in this space. But I was put in a position where I had to decide between being a good Mennonite being a good Christian, being a good feminist leader of this program, and being a person who would stand unequivocally with LGBTQ friends. So I had to decide in myself, I'm going to be a bad Mennonite, a bad Christian, and a bad Christian feminist, because unless I make that decision, I will not be able to actually have integrity in relationships with people who I care about.
Just dovetailing off of, talking about being good and bad. I ask most people who come on the podcast this question. Stephanie and Hilary, how would you respond? And I'm sure this has happened to you in your line of work, but how would you respond if someone said that you were a bad Christian because of the work you do, both, in your personal lives and also into account?
Well, I don't identify as a Christian, so I think the first, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I've encountered versions of that situation all the time. And my first impulse is to say, why are you assuming that I have the same faith commitments that you do? Is it just work that I do? But so yes, if I'm a Christian, I'm a bad Christian because I don't identify as a Christian. What I think I am really, I'm a really bad ex-Christian.
Oh.
Because I will not walk away. It's not that I participate in, I mean, I don't go to church. I don't identify as a believer. I have my own spiritual practices that are not, I mean, whatever, they're probably Christian communities where they would be fine, but I mean, it's something that I struggle with. I'm also very bad ex-Mennonite. I definitely identify as an ex-Mennonite, but I feel like I need to identify as an ex-Mennonite because having been raised and indoctrinated as a Mennonite was such a formative thing for me. And I've spent so much time recovering from it. I've learned so much from recovering from it. And so it's like, yeah, if somebody says you're a bad Christian, I'm just like, where do you want to start? We can talk all day about what that means. How do you define a Christian? How do you define a bad Christian? I mean, I will get people riled up about definitions until the cows come home. That's
yeah. Getting people riled about definitions is something that Stephanie and I have in common. That's probably the direction that I would go to. But my kind of just internal affective response is just to kind of chuckle, what's it doing for you? What is it doing for you to feel like you can call me a bad Christian? It's not doing anything for me. I genuinely am not interested in whether you think I'm a good or bad Christian. So yeah, it just kind of raises my eyebrows a little bit and makes me want to have a conversation about why is that what you are invested in, particularly in light of the conversation I expect prompted it, which is a conversation about human beings experiencing sexual assault and violence as a result of the way that Christian communities are organized today.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I also think it's really important, in this, as part of this bad Christian conversation, that when I feel like Christians get away with so much harm by harming people to the point that they can't participate in Christian communities anymore or don't want to. And then saying, well, we don't have to listen to you because you're not participating anymore. And that happens to survivors all the time. That happens to queer folks all the time. That it's just oh, we're going to persecute you until you can't be here anymore. And then we're going to be like, oh, well, we don't have to listen to you. You're not doing the hard work of being in community, blah, 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 blah. And it's I think that is one of the ethical undercurrents of Into Account. It's the survivors who work with us are all over the map when it comes to their own faith. We work with many people who are very devout Christians. We work with some people who are never going to darken the door of a church again. And like, we can work with people within that range. What we insist on is that whether or not you still identify with the faith tradition in where you experienced harm, you have a right to hold that tradition accountable for the harm you experienced. Like, when your church gets rid of somebody, whether it's explicitly or implicitly, they don't get to say, oh, we don't have to deal with that person anymore. It's like, when you're in the business of moralizing and morality, you don't get to do that. That's what I think.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm a bad Christian I just refuse to stop holding Christians accountable for what they do to people.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate all of that. So do you have any final advice for a survivor seeking support? Any resources to offer other than the Into Account website, which I will absolutely link below, and any other like websites or anything you can send to me and I'll link them. But yeah, any final advice?
I would say trust yourself. So much of what survivors are up against is individuals, communities, histories, patterns, cultures, trying to get survivors to feel like their gut, their intuition, their authority, their voice, their sense of what needs to happen is not trustworthy. And based on the research that we've done, based on the work we've done with, at this point, like truly countless survivors. So in other words, I'm trying to frame this as saying, like, this isn't just like a platitude or a nice thing that people are supposed to say when they talk about sexual violence, but actually, I think it makes all of the rational sense in the world to just trust yourself, trust your gut, and make decisions that feel like they are good decisions for you.
I think of Tarana Burke, who was the founder of the Me Too movement, the original pre-hashtag Me Too movement, and is just always a good go-to person for really thoughtful intersectional perspective on sexual violence. And she often points out that the hashtag Me Too movement has created this sort of feeling for survivors that you haven't really done what you're supposed to do until you have come forward publicly with your story, until you've written a blog post or done an interview or made your Me Too Twitter post or whatever. And she really encourages people, don't measure yourself by those standards. Like, the important thing is, like, is this story still lodged in your body? Is it still lodged in your throat? Have you spoken your own truth to yourself yet? Those things are more important than what public forum you choose or don't choose. So don't feel like hashtag Me Too or hashtag Church Too means that you have to do anything in particular. The most important place to start is that you can stand in your own truth, that it's not just lodged in your body eating you up. And if you can take that step, other steps will become clearer.
Yeah, I appreciate that kind of sense of embodied view of truth. Like, is it still living in your body? I like that. Something that has stuck out as we have been talking this entire time is kind of this, I forget about like how there is like the trauma of the actual event of harm, but then how much more, I think you call it like secondary trauma that comes with the gaslighting that happens, like the questioning the motivations, questioning the memory, questioning everything of the survivor. So that is something that stuck out that I hadn't thought about as much. So thank you for that. But I also wanted to say that as we were talking, I have this overwhelming sense of like safety and security, just knowing that your organization exists and that you two are out there, that I could reach out and say, help me in this situation, and that you would be there and you would believe me. So I think it's an incredible gift that you all are bringing to people that are just so in need of accountability, or not accountability. Well, they need accountability from the person that's harming them, but they need this justice, and they need people to believe them. So I just want to say thank you for the work that you're doing. I am sure it is not easy, and yeah. So I'm just saying, I know that it is appreciated if you are not told that often enough. Yeah. We often end the podcast with a blessing, but I want to ask if there's any final thoughts before, and if it's okay if I leave us with a blessing today.
Sure.
Yeah, it's okay. Maybe one final thought is just that I'm glad that you mentioned the secondary trauma, because a large percentage of survivors will say that the trauma they experience from betrayal from their communities, from their communities of faith, in other words, what they experience in the aftermath of the assault itself, ends up feeling like a greater trauma than the trauma of the assault itself. So sexual violence, it's wrong to think of sexual violence as a sexual event that happens between two or more people. Sexual violence and the trauma that it carries really is the entirety of that event itself and the context of the relationship in which it occurred, and the way that one's community and society responds. So I'm just really grateful that you pointed that out.
Yeah. I also, this is unrelated, but I also know, because of how creepy Facebook is, that Hilary, you have 2 dogs, and sometimes I like to invite people to bring their pets on for the blessing. So if your pets are available, if you're in your house, and Stephanie, you have a cat, I think. Gosh, I feel like such a weirdo.
Oh, no. You're our kind of weirdo. I have 3 cats, but I'm not at home. My parents-in-law have a cat, but she'll scratch my face off if I try to do
That's
I do.
Can I go get my dogs?
Yes, please. That's exactly what I'm asking for. Stephanie and Hilary and Julep and all your animals and everyone listening and watching the podcast, may you go from this episode, like Hilary said, may you go knowing that your lived reality is valid, that you can trust yourself. And I pray that Stephanie, you and Hilary can continue your work, because it's so needed. And I think that what you are doing is really hard and really beautiful. And I'm just repeating myself now, but it's so needed. And I just appreciate you all so much. That's all. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you for this conversation. It's been really good.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for being on. I appreciate it. And bringing your precious dog. Oh my gosh. So cute.
It's ridiculous.
I love it. Okay. Well, thank you all for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time.
All right.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.